The first time I ever saw the ship, I was 20 years old and foolish enough to believe that loyalty was a kind of currency that always came back with interest. She was docked in Baltimore Harbor, her hull dark and immense against a bruised orange sunset, cranes bending over her like mechanical giraffes, containers stacked high in reds and blues and faded greens. Her name was painted in white along the bow, Providence Star. I remember thinking the name felt like a promise. 70 years later, at 90 years old, I stood in front of that same ship with a cane in my trembling hand and realized promises don't always belong to the people who believe in them most. I gave my life to her, and in the end, my family gave me away. Back in 1956, the world felt wide and loud and hungry. I had grown up in a narrow row house in Dundalk, Maryland, the son of a steel worker who came home every night with soot in the creases of his palms. My mother kept the house smelling of boiled cabbage and starch, and my two younger sisters shared a room no bigger than a closet. We didn't talk about dreams in my family. We talked about bills. But when I saw the Providence Star for the first time, towering over the dock like a floating city, something in me shifted. I'd taken a temporary job hauling crates just to keep money coming in after my father injured his back at the mill. The pay was small, the hours long, but the harbor, God, the harbor felt alive. Diesel fumes, salt water wind, the metallic shriek of cranes swinging containers through the air. And that ship, she wasn't the biggest in the fleet even then, but she was steady, reliable. The older dock hand spoke about her like she was a workhorse that never bucked, never faltered. "She'll outlast us all," one of them said, spitting tobacco into the water. I didn't know how right he'd be. My first official position aboard her was as a deckhand. I scrubbed rust from railings until my fingers bled. I hauled lines thick as my wrist. I stood watch at night when the ocean stretched black and endless around us. The sea changes a man. It teaches him how small he is. It teaches him patience. It teaches him fear. But it also teaches him purpose. By the time I was 25, I knew every creak in her hull. I could walk her decks blindfolded. I knew how she leaned in a crosswind and how she cut through storm waves. When rain lashed against her steel sides, I felt protective, like she was mine, even though she belonged to the shipping company. I met Eleanor the same year I was promoted to assistant bosun. She had chestnut hair and a laugh that made you believe in brighter days. I saw her at a church picnic when I was home between routes. She was pouring lemonade for the children, sunlight caught in her curls. "You look like you belong somewhere else," she told me that first afternoon. "I belong at sea," I answered without thinking. She tilted her head. "Then why are you staring at me like you want to stay?" I married her within a year. I told myself I could balance both, the ship and a family. Plenty of men did. They sailed, they earned good money, they came home with stories and souvenirs. But the ocean doesn't share well. I missed our first anniversary because of a mechanical delay in Rotterdam. I missed the birth of our first son, Danielle, because a storm forced us to reroute across the Atlantic. I held him for the first time when he was already 3 weeks old. Eleanor never complained, at least not at first. "Just promise me you'll come home safe," she'd say. pressing her forehead to mine before I left, and I always promised. Years blurred into decades. The Providence Star modernized. Old cranes were replaced, engines upgraded. I climbed the ranks until I became chief mate in my 40s. My hands grew thick and scarred. My shoulders stooped slightly from years of bracing against wind and waves. Daniel grew into a quiet boy with sharp eyes. Our daughter, Rebecca, was born 5 years after him. She inherited her mother's laugh. I tried to be present when I was home. I coached Little League one summer. I built a treehouse in the backyard that leaned a little to the left. I read bedtime stories with a voice still rough from salt air, but home always felt like a port stop. Temporary. When Daniel was 13, he stood at the kitchen table while I packed my duffel bag. "Why do you always have to go back?" he asked. "Because it's my job," I said gently. He looked at me in a way that felt older than his years. "You like it more than being here." That's not true. But even as I said it, I wasn't entirely sure. Eleanor's silence that evening was louder than any argument. The money was good. Better than good. We moved out of Dundalk into a modest 2-story house with a white fence. The kids went to better schools. We took one family vacation to Florida, where Daniel built sand castles and Rebecca screamed at the cold Atlantic water. I paid for braces, for college savings, for a new car when Eleanor's old one finally died in the driveway. Every container I watched loaded onto the Providence Star felt like another brick in the life I was building for them. I told myself sacrifice was love in its purest form. When I turned 55, I was offered a shoreside management position. Less travel, more stability. I turned it down. The idea of leaving the ship felt like cutting off a limb. "You're choosing her again," Eleanor said quietly that night. "It's not about choosing," I insisted. "It's about who I am." She nodded, but something in her eyes dimmed. Daniel went off to college in Chicago and rarely called. Rebecca studied nursing in Boston and phoned her mother twice a week. When I tried to speak with them, there was a polite distance in their voices, like they were talking to a relative instead of a father. Still, I kept sailing. Storms came and went. I watched lightning split the sky over the Pacific. I stood on deck in the middle of the night, salt spray freezing against my cheeks, feeling more alive than anywhere else. The Providence Star aged, but so did I. Newer ships joined the fleet, sleeker and faster. She remained steady, dependable. By 70, most men are retired. They sit on porches. They play with grandchildren. I was still crossing oceans. Eleanor's health began to decline around then. Arthritis first, then her heart. "I need you home," she whispered from her hospital bed one winter evening. Snow pressed against the windows. Machines beeped steadily beside her. "I'll retire," I said, gripping her frail hand. "I promise." But the shipping company needed me for one last long-term contract, overseeing a massive refit of the Providence Star. 6 months, I told Eleanor. Just 6 months. She forced a smile. The ship always gets the last word. She passed away 3 months later. I wasn't there. A faulty communication line delayed the message. By the time I reached Baltimore, the funeral had already taken place. Daniel met me at the cemetery. "You missed it," he said flatly. I tried. You always try. There was no shouting, no dramatic scene, just a wall between us that felt insurmountable. I buried my grief in work. The Providence Star became my only constant companion. I talked to her sometimes on night watch, my voice swallowed by wind. "You're all I've got left," I'd murmur. Years stacked upon years. My hair thinned to white. My gait slowed, but I stayed. At 85, the company insisted I take an advisory role. I no longer climbed rigging. I no longer stood through full night watches. Instead, I walked her decks slowly, hand trailing along cool steel, remembering the young man I'd been. Daniel and Rebecca visited occasionally. They were polite, distant. Their children, my grandchildren, looked at me like I was a stranger who smelled faintly of salt and diesel. I tried to bridge the gap with stories. "Did you know your grandpa sailed through a typhoon in '72? I'd begin. They'd nod, distracted by phones. When I turned 90, the company held a small ceremony on deck. A few executives shook my hand. A cake was cut in the galley. 70 years with the Providence Star, the CEO said. An extraordinary legacy. I felt proud. That pride didn't last long. A week later, Daniel asked to meet. We sat in a quiet office overlooking the harbor. The Providence Star was docked behind him, cranes moving in slow arcs. "We need to talk about your future," he began. "My future?" I chuckled. "Son, I'm 90. "Exactly." Rebecca joined him, hands folded tightly in her lap. "We think it's time you move into assisted living," she said carefully. I blinked. "I'm fine." "You live alone in that old house," Daniel pressed. "You're still trying to climb ship ladders." "I'm not climbing anything," I snapped. They exchanged a look. "We've already spoken to a facility," Rebecca said. "It's very nice, clean, professional." "And my house," Daniel cleared his throat. "We'll handle it, sell it, use the funds for your care." A coldness seeped into my chest. "You've already decided." "It's what's best," he said firmly. "For who?" Silence. I realized then that the life I thought I'd built for them had moved forward without me. They weren't asking. They were informing. "I won't go," I said. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Dad, don't make this difficult." "Difficult? 70 years of missed birthdays. 70 years of storms and salt and steel. 70 years believing I was doing the right thing. And now I was difficult. They moved quickly after that. Legal paperwork I barely understood. Discussions about safety, liability, my age. I fought at first. Pride can keep an old man standing longer than his knees allow. But in the end, signatures were signed. The day I left my house, I paused on the porch. The white fence needed repainting. The tree house I built decades ago had collapsed into splintered wood. Daniel carried a box to his car. Rebecca hugged me lightly. "This is for the best." I didn't answer. Instead, I asked to be driven to the harbor first. They were reluctant, but they agreed. The Providence Star loomed exactly as she had all those years ago. Massive, steady, patient. I stepped out of the car slowly. The wind off the water cut through my coat. I walked as close as security allowed. A few younger crew members recognized me and nodded respectfully. I placed my hand against her hull. Cold steel. "You and me," I whispered. Daniel stood behind me. "Dad, it's just a ship." I turned to him, really looked at him. The lines around his eyes, the impatience. "No," I said softly. It was my life. He didn't understand. maybe he never would. They drove me to the assisted living facility that afternoon. The room was small, neutral walls, a bed too narrow, a window that faced a parking lot instead of open water. At night, I lay awake, listening for the groan of engines, the slap of waves. All I heard was the hum of fluorescent lights. Days blended together, meals on schedule, medication cups, polite nurses. Daniel visited once a month, Rebecca twice. I stopped telling sea stories. One evening, as I watched the sun sink behind rows of parked cars, a nurse asked gently, "What do you miss the most?" I closed my eyes. The feeling of being needed, because that's what the ship had given me. Not just purpose, but necessity. Out there, in storms and darkness, I mattered. Here, I was an obligation. Months passed. My strength faded. Walking became harder. But one morning, before dawn, I made a decision. I dressed slowly, slipped on my old captain's jacket, took my cane. The front desk nurse looked startled. "Mr. Hayes, where are you going?" "For a walk." I didn't wait for permission. The harbor was only a mile away, a mile that felt like 10. My breath came in ragged pulls. My legs trembled. But when I reached the dock and saw the Providence Star preparing to depart, something in me straightened. Crew bustled about. Engines rumbled. A young officer spotted me. "Sir, you shouldn't be out here alone. I've stood on this deck longer than you've been alive," I said with a faint smile. They let me aboard, just for a few minutes. I stood at the railing as the sun rose, casting gold across the water. Tears blurred my vision. "I gave you 70 years, I whispered to the ship. In return, she had given me identity. As the horn sounded low and deep, I felt something settle inside me. Maybe my family didn't understand. Maybe they never would. But I knew the truth. I had lived fully, fiercely, on my terms. And even if I had lost their closeness, I had not lost myself. The wind brushed against my face one last time, carrying salt and memory. When Daniel got the call later that day that I had collapsed peacefully in my room at the facility, he drove to the harbor instead of the hospital. The Providence Star was gone, already a dark shape on the horizon. For the first time in his life, he understood that he had never been competing with a ship. He had been competing with the sea, and the sea had always won.